Good morning, all, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're going to allow just a few seconds for everyone to enter into the room and get situated. If you have any questions or need troubleshooting tips, you can enter those into the chat. And I'm Jasmine, I'll help facilitate those issues with you. And we'll give it just a few more seconds as our numbers are still rising.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being on and helping us out today.
Good morning.
Okay, and with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Pruitt to get us started.
Thank you, Jasmine. Good morning, everyone. So glad that you all were able to join us this morning for this kickoff of our summer webinar series. And as you know, economies across the country are making demands for more highly skilled workers. As such, colleges and universities are placing more emphasis on the concept of student success. As such, during the COVID-19 pandemic, institutions of higher education were required to shift the way in which they support their students to ensure that they adapted to the new online and hybrid learning environment. This morning, we are joined by a very distinguished panel of higher education administrators that were responsible for assisting their campuses with the shift in learning modalities and student support. Joining us are Drs. Kimberly Gold, Dr. Randall Brumfield, Ms. Stacey Bradley, and hopefully Dr. Ontario Wooden will rejoin us because he's having a campus power outage this morning, but we hope that he can come back and join the conversation. Dr. Kimberly Gold joined the North Carolina Community College System office in July 2019 as the Senior Vice President and Chief Academic Officer. Prior to serving in this role, Dr. Gold served as the 5th President of Robeson Community College in North Carolina. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Gold. Dr. Brumfield serves as the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Student Success with the Louisiana Board of Regents, and he started there in 2019. In his role, he is responsible for coordinating and assessing the board's master plan progress, as well as managing its initiatives focused on helping the state reach its higher education attainment goals. Stacey Bradley serves as the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs and Academic Support, administering the University of South Carolina's undergraduate scholarship budget, overseeing the University 101 programs, the National Center for First Year Experience, the Student Success Center, and the Career Center. She also is responsible for Student Affairs Communication. We are delighted to have you, Vice President Bradley. Before we kick off the discussion this morning, let's hear directly from a group of students themselves. SRAB recently had the opportunity to interview students to learn what challenges they face in completing college amid the pandemic and as a whole. Here's a sample of what we heard.
Hi, my name is Ashley Young, and I'm a 2021 graduate.
Hello, my name is Ataria Yancey. I am from Memphis, Tennessee. I currently attend Middle Tennessee State University.
Being a first-generation college student was a unique experience in itself. I had no idea what I was doing. I realized my study habits weren't there, and basic fundamentals of college, such as prerequisites, I just had no knowledge about.
Having to move out of my apartment midway through the pandemic, and that was pretty stressful.
I needed help, and I didn't know where to go, and I didn't feel supported, and that can really make or break a student.
What I did to overcome some of those obstacles was to just remind myself to have that stick-to-itiveness that I needed in order to complete my degree.
If I wasn't resilient and adaptable, that semester where I was struggling and I felt alone and nobody was helping me with my future, my mental health, I just felt defeated. If I was even weaker, I would have dropped out because that is rough.
I had college counselors through this program called KTC, which is Kip Through College, and they help pay for some of the occurring costs that happened during the pandemic, including moving costs and technology.
As I got into the higher exercise and sports science courses with less people, I was lucky enough to become close with professors that would mentor me and guide me in the right direction. If there's one thing I could change about the college experience, it would be to have a designated role to check in on students, see if they need help, point them in the right direction or resources, and be there for them, let them know they're not alone, and be able to show them where to go when they're in need of help, and to be accessible and to make themselves known. That would have made a really big difference in my college experience.
What I look most forward to in these coming months when I graduate is to become a school social worker and gain my master's degree in social work.
This fall, I am headed to downtown Knoxville, Tennessee, and am getting my master's in occupational therapy at Tennessee Wesleyan University. And I'm so excited to start working. And after I work for a little while, I'm going to go back online, hopefully, and get my doctorate in occupational therapy.
I hope that short clip helped to set the tone for this morning's conversation. I see that Dr. Wooden, who is Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Alcorn State University, was able to rejoin us. So we welcome you, Dr. Wooden.
Good morning. So we are growing at Alcorn, a couple of construction projects going on, and planned outages aren't going quite as planned, but glad to be here, be back with you all this morning.
Thank you. So with that, we'll jump right into this morning's conversation. So our first question is, what were the largest challenges that students in your state, system, or institution faced during the pandemic relative to their continued success?
I guess I'll start with that. I think many of them were highlighted in the video. What comes to mind for me is definitely finances. The young man talked about having to move out of the apartment and make some other transitions. And so definitely the finances to do that. I would say support services as well. While many of us transition to some virtual, online, hybrid formats, there were a need for academic support. There was a need for some technology supports as well. And I would also say there were, I guess, family concerns or caregiving roles that a number of our students have that we need to help them sort through and work out as well.
Thank you.
And I would just add to Dr. Wooden's remarks on this is that certainly the challenges in transitioning to an online environment, provided no shortage of trial and tribulations for students and their families in our state, adjusting to learn online technology to begin with, and then trying to access it, as the formidable alternative to in-person learning. So there was certainly a learning curve on the part of the learners in adjusting to this, and there was also a learning curve on the part of faculty to be able to adjust to the technology needs. So, coming at it from just a purely educational cognitive perspective, that was a significant challenge in our state in ensuring that, there was broadband access to all points in between. So, that was something that I think was certainly highlighted and addressed over the course of the past year. Still got a ways to go, but was a good start to really identifying some issues that have been persistent for quite some time nonetheless.
Sure, thank you.
I would echo what Dr. Wooden and Dr. Brumfield have said so far. I think isolation was a really big factor. So traditional methods of engagement had changed for students. There weren't large events to kick off a semester. Many of our students here in Columbia, many of our students actually did return to campus. So we reopened in August 2020 after a very extensive planning process over the summer. And so we reopened. We had students in campus housing that remained for the full year. We had the mix of in-person, hybrid, and online courses, but everything was different. And so whether it was that there were small group activities or anything large was virtual, faculty engagement was different. It was challenging for students from a belonging standpoint to really find their niche and connect. I'd also echo what Dr. Wooden said about financial need. We administered a survey to our continuing students back in early May 2020, just to get a feel initially for what to expect, even though no one knew what to expect coming into the fall. And then we conducted outreach to all of our continuing students over the summer. So more than 16,000 students we called through our Student Success Center and 200 volunteers, and continually heard the themes about job loss, about medical costs, and really had an opportunity on the front end with some decisions we made about need-based aid, which I think is really important because that's a place where early decisions to reduce costs could actually hinder enrollment, student success in the long term. So a relatively small investment can have a multiplying effect in terms of student enrollment and student success. And we made those decisions early to reinvest in our students, and it paid off. So had our highest retention rate in the university's history this past fall, and also recruited the most diverse class and the most South Carolina residents in our incoming class that we've ever had. And so I think those reinvestments are really important in our students.
Good points that you bring up there about how you invested in your campus to support students financially. Great. Comments, Dr. Gold?
No, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I will touch on several of the things that the other panelists have talked about as well. I think the one thing I will emphasize in terms of my comments is in North Carolina, we have 58 community colleges that are embedded all across the state. And so many of them are rural. And so when we did a survey of our colleges in the spring of 20 and summer of 20, by far the number one issue and the number one challenge that they faced was just getting broadband access to our students and getting devices to those students so that they could access the internet if they had it. So I think that was our number one first challenge that we faced and first hurdle to making that transition. And then as others have mentioned, just adjusting them to the online learning environment. It is a very different environment than in-person learning. And if you think about some of our programs that are more skill-based, that have traditionally been offered in an in-person format, think about welding, cosmetology, electricians, HVAC, those type of programs where hands-on, having your hands-on and learning a skill is very important to the learning process. Adjusting and adapting to an online environment is very different. Now we did continue to have some in-person classes, but of course we socially distance. And so the learning environment was just different. And that transition, particularly for our technical and career-oriented students, was much more difficult. And then, I think the thing you mentioned that prior to being here at the system office, I served at Robinson Community College. Robinson is a college in Eastern North Carolina that was hit by two devastating hurricanes in 2016 and 2018 and during my tenure there. And I think one of the things that I saw there is anytime you disrupt the people's lives and their living circumstances are changed and their norms and their habits are changed, our students experience a lot of stress, and that stress can be cumulative. So in the beginning, it's stressful, but the longer that the event continues, whether it be a pandemic or recovery from a hurricane, that stress tends to accumulate. And so we've just seen a lot of students, some of them stopping out, but by and large, the predominant response that we see is students start to reduce their course load. So they start taking fewer classes, which means they progress more slowly, which has its own stressors. So I think it's important not to forget that our students are under stress, which makes the services and the wraparound supports that we provide for students even more important during transitional or changing times.
Absolutely. And Dr. Gold, you hit on a point that's connected to the next question about the transition to online or hybrid learning environments. So could you explain the challenges faced from your various perspectives for assisting students with that transition? Traditionally, we know students most often learn in an environment that provides a face-to-face learning experience. So what were some of the issues or challenges faced with helping not only students, I suppose, but faculty to transition from a traditional environment to an online or hybrid environment?
Sure, and I think you make a great point in that in this particular instance during the pandemic, not only were our students transitioning, but our faculty and our institutions were transitioning. So, typically as an educational institution, if you're going to bring about change, you like to do that in a planned way so that it seems seamless to your students. But this happened so quickly that our faculty and our students were really having to adapt at the same time. So as I mentioned before, I think the first hurdle was just that access to internet and devices. And so we had colleges that set up hotspots in their parking lot so people could drive in and get access to internet. They loaned devices, they loaned hotspots for home use. But even once you have the device, you have to understand how to use it. And so we also found that digital literacy and just having the skills to navigate that virtual environment is really important. And, before we started the panel, we were laughing about some of the adjustments that we've had to make in our environment, meeting in a virtual space. And I was sharing that I know more about my coworkers' family and pets than I've ever known, because oftentimes when you're meeting and you're doing it at home, children walk into the room, pets wander in front of the camera. And so, imagine that for our students. I think that probably the most often used phrase I've heard over the past year is, by the way, you're on mute. So even we have had to make those adaptations and learn we were talking about Teams versus Zoom. So learning the environment. So even once you get access, just learning the technology, learning to use that technology is really challenging for students. And then on top of learning it, they're trying to learn academic content. So I think that you just multiply the challenge associated with that. And the other thing I would just, I touched on earlier, particularly hands-on skills, that learning environment is even more accelerated. With our general education courses, we've been moving to an online format for years. So a lot of those students are kind of accustomed to having at least a mix of online classes. But for our skill-based and career-oriented programs, many of those students had never taken an online course. So that transition was much harder and much more challenging for the faculty. Transitioning course that you've always taught in an in-person environment to the online environment can be a challenge. And one of the things that we know is when you first put a course online, you're just getting it there. And so it's probably not as robust or engaging as it could be. So as the pandemic stretched out, not only helping them get that content online, but then helping them improve that content, helping them make it engaging for students. Our state invested in Quality Matters training for our faculty. We also did training specific to teaching diverse populations and engaging students with different learning styles and different backgrounds. So made a huge investment in that. And I think that's really paid off. But I think the point about our students and faculty were transitioning at the same time is just a really important point, because that just makes it even more difficult and challenging.
Right. Thank you.
I want to echo some of the challenges that Dr. Gold mentioned related to broadband access. So we are in Southwest Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. So our students also had a number of challenges that we had to work through as a campus and through their home communities as well. The realities that I found was that some students actually had to email assignments in as that became available. I think a few folks even went to the old fax machine when they could get to a place to send things in. You know, one of the phrases next to you're on mute is we're gonna have to pivot. So pivot became this word that we used a lot here, and that was both in the student space and the faculty space. This conversation around Zoom over Teams versus Blue Jeans or any other uh, uh, way to have meetings became really interesting because I think lots of us didn't think that we needed to adopt one system to use for campus. And so I looked up one day and I had 3 meetings on 3 different modes, and I was thinking, wow, what must students be experiencing in this way? And so we purchased Zoom here at Alcorn as kind of the predominant system. As it relates to course taking, while our students had some experience, as was mentioned, in taking even an online course in high school, and definitely in our general education curriculum, it's very different to take one course online versus 5 or 6 courses online. And this whole idea of developing community, developing and strengthening that sense of belonging, all of that was challenged in that space. And so our president called one day and she said, we need to send a survey out. And she said, we're going to send the survey to the faculty. We're also going to send the survey to students. And I said, so what is this survey going to say? She said, I want to know how they're doing. And we developed about 5 questions that we sent out to students and faculty. And we asked them how they were doing. We asked them if they felt that we were communicating sufficiently and efficiently. And the information that we found was much better, I think, than we anticipated. So folks felt supported. Folks felt that we'd been communicating. And, you know, that was really good to see, given no one had a manual on how to get through a pandemic. And so that became important as well. But to the prior question, this idea around finances came up and the idea of need-based aid. Hopefully, on the other side of this, whenever that is, we can reignite some of the conversations, not only around college cost, but also around need-based aid. We've spent lots of energy on merit-based aid and rewarding and awarding those students who perform well. But one of the things this has highlighted is the fact that we have students both in rural, urban America across all types of campuses who would get through college in a more timely manner with much less stress, as described by the students in some of the videos, if we were to make larger investments in our need-based aid.
So
Excellent. Go ahead, Dr. Brumfield.
No, I'll be brief. I'll just not to really expand on anything that Drs. Gold or Wooden has already mentioned, but you know, from our perspective in the state of Louisiana, from the outset, our Commissioner of Higher Education, Kim Hunter-Reed, the Board of Regents, and our staff focused on this like a laser beam to make sure that students could be successful in an online environment, not just in post-secondary, but with our partners in K-12. We reached out to our proprietary schools. We reached out to our private academic licensed institutions in the state, as well as our regionally accredited institutions. We really tried to have a really broad coordinated effort in how we supported students across the state, whether they were one of our public institutions or they were at an institution of any type of learning. If they were in the process of trying to improve their well-being and their station in life, it was really more of a truly a holistic effort in supporting citizens from across the state. One thing that I would just add to this is that the master plan for the board really focuses on workforce development. It's called Louisiana Prospers, and the idea behind it is that every individual in the state has an opportunity to improve their situation. And so we use that as sort of a leveraging tool to really build out what we needed to support students during this time, and to really drive home the fact that we're looking to improve learning and also training for life after post-secondary, whatever that looks like. One little tidbit I would just add also, going back to I believe what Dr. Gold mentioned, was finding a place for people to access broadband. In our office, we have a number of places, a number of teams that work on these type of things. It's funny how the pandemic really coalesces all our different sections within our office to really get to really serve the public. And whether it's finance, whether it's our finance team, whether it's our academic affairs team, whether it's our IT team that supports our office, at the end of the day, they all lend something to this effort. And talking about broadband access, the first thing our online library team, we have a state online library resource, and we have a staff in our office devoted to that. They were front and center, reaching out to cable providers, broadband providers, and developing a web page where people could go, students and families could go to see where they could access broadband in their communities. So that was one thing that we learned on the fly, was to be able to deliver that kind of service.
Thank you all for those responses. I want to shift.
Dr. Lawrence,
go
can I
ahead.
add just one piece to that? I just wanted to add on to one additional item. Dr. Wooden mentioned the surveys. We did a similar academic excellence survey that we sent out mid-fall. And one of the things that we realized was that clarity of expectations on modality was so important. What does hybrid mean? If it's online, is it synchronous or is it asynchronous? And what does that mean? And that would remain consistent. And so it wasn't just that it was different, but if it flipped after a few weeks or after a student signed up before the course was actually delivered, that made a really big difference. And so making sure that those adjustments were made going into the spring in terms of expectation setting for faculty and for students, and making sure that there was clear communication between the two about what to expect was really important.
Thanks for that. You mentioned earlier, Ms. Bradley, about how your campus experienced the highest, I think it was, retention rate in the history of the institution during the pandemic, or the early part of the pandemic. With that, can you speak a little bit about, we talked a lot about academic affairs type scenarios and issues, but can you speak a little bit about how from a student affairs side, you were able to keep students engaged outside of the classroom, which we all know contributes to the success and retention of students as well?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So as I've alluded to, we did a lot of surveying our students at various times to really gain their feedback. We also had a series of future planning groups, and we had students embedded in those groups. So we had an academic excellence group, a student services and enrollment group, a finance group, a risk management and safety group, and students were embedded in those groups to give us feedback. And it was really important that where we could engage in person, we did in small groups, one-on-one. We leaned on a lot of the mechanisms we had in place, whether it was U101 instructors or whether it was our residence life coordinators, our academic advisors, knowing that there were places where we couldn't be in person, and making sure that those online services were available and accessible, and in many cases expanding those services. So I think that's one of the silver linings from the pandemic, is that where we didn't have people commuting, we could extend service delivery hours. And so because they were remote, they could offer, whether it's, a student that is able to connect with their tutor at 9 p.m. from their couch, or whether it's being able to access a career coach for some of our students that were trying to figure out, my internship is not going to happen. What do I do? What are my plans? And so I think that there were sort of a series of pieces, leveraging what we could at the time, and then listening to that feedback, so that when we had the opportunity, when the risk mitigation procedures worked and we were able to safely do a little bit more, we very cautiously expanded out to try to enhance that engagement. And so where it might only have been groups of 5 to start with, then it was groups of 10 by late fall. By the spring, maybe it was 20, and really trying to find ways that that we could have more frequent opportunities rather than those large, there's no football game. So because you don't have that on Saturday, what are those smaller opportunities and activities that we could have for students to make sure that they're connecting and belonging?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to add to that piece of the conversation from that side of the house, if you will?
I was thinking as Stacey was talking about, kind of watching students on the lawn outside of my office. And there were activities that the student affairs and student engagement team pulled together. I think it got to a point where students decided, let's kind of go rogue and see what we can get away with. And I looked out one day and, students had activities on the lawn. And so then the question becomes, now, how many folks are out there on that? Are they socially distanced? And so I think our students in a very responsible way started to be partners with student affairs and student engagement, which I think gave them a nudge to say, hey, they're ready to do more, moving away from being too cautious to really getting active and getting engaged. And I think by mid to late spring, many of those activities, the numbers had increased and folks were still wearing masks and continuing to be safe. And so hats off to our student affairs team for that part. The other piece is that tutoring was mentioned earlier. We established a relationship with Upswing to provide that 24-hour tutoring and support for students. And so once we were able to figure out the academic support piece, then definitely we stepped up our efforts in the student engagement, the student activities space, and our students followed suit. And I think they taught us some things that, mainly many of them were not as fearful as, we thought they would be. And definitely nudged us to say, hey, let's be cautious, but let's try. As was mentioned earlier, we came back fall 2020, full steam. We were 70% of our classes were face-to-face, 30% hybrid and online. Same thing we did for the spring semester. And so I think our students said, well, if you're going to let us come back and you're going to trust us in the academic space, then we can do more in the student engagement space as well.
Right.
I'll also add, I want to give a shout out to my CAO colleagues in the Mississippi IHL. On our monthly CAO meetings, there was an agenda item that, kind of ask everyone how they're doing and what's going on their campuses. And one of my colleagues at Mississippi State talked about how they were easing into allowing students to do activities. And so we're going to try this weekend, do an assessment, see how it goes. And it was definitely good to hear him say that and learn from other CAOs in the system about how they were getting students engaged, getting students involved.
Outstanding. Considering this pivot that has occurred and this change, right? What structures or components of this change would you all consider or plan to continue to use post-pandemic?
Well, I'll try to, oh, sorry.
No, I'll defer. Go ahead.
I think, one of the things that we've noticed during the pandemic and as we've started to transition is, and back to Stacey's comment earlier about different learning modalities and being able to define those, is prior to the pandemic, we offered online, we offered hybrid, blended, asynchronous, synchronous, but we rarely did all of those in the same section. And so what we found during the pandemic is all our students have different needs. They have different health concerns. Some wanted to be in the classroom. We had classes where half the class would attend on one day, the other half would attend the other day, and the half that wasn't in person would attend virtually. So I think what we've realized, and we've all kind of looked at each other and said, our students have these needs anyway. They've always juggled family obligations and work and other responsibilities outside the classroom. And we've kind of wondered, why haven't we made opportunities for those students to continue to engage with the learning environment when they have to be at home with a sick child or when they have to care for a loved one. So I think that what we're calling flexible learning options, where you have different modalities in the same classroom, in the same course, is going to continue. And on a system level, the challenge is, how do you define those? And how do you even track how students are attending class if one day they're in person and another day they may be attending online? So it really changes our thinking about how we structure courses and how we define them, the terms that we use for courses. So I really think it's causing a shift, but it really is a shift we should have been thinking about anyway. I think this has just accelerated that process. The other thing I think that we will keep is we've invested a lot of money and time and energy in faculty professional development. And I think that we know that's got to continue, because if these changes are going to be permanent, if we're going to continue more virtual options for technical skills classes, if we're going to continue flexible learning, we have to make sure that our faculty are comfortable with that technology and that they're able to deliver engaged content and engaged student experience, regardless of how that student encounters the class.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add on top of faculty development, which I think is something that will persist far beyond over the course of the past year, is just basically looking at different ways that we assess student learning. And you know, in the state of Louisiana, we rely on a very, I think, more or less a prescriptive approach to placement and how we place students, particularly in math and English. And so we do have a statewide policy on those things. Last year, at the outset of the pandemic, as you recall, both ACT and SAT were limited in what they were able to do in administering exams to students. And so we use ACT and SAT as optional criteria for admissions in the state to institutions, but we also require, we allow for ACT or SAT to be used as placement for English and for math. And so so we did adopt an emergency policy over the past year that allowed for greater flexibility with how we place students into post-secondary courses, as well as for dual enrollment courses. So, you know, we still have a little bit to do in understanding and digesting what the results of that looks like, to have greater flexibility to, you know, allow for institutions to determine what best works for them in assessing student learning and performance. But at the end of the day, you know, this has been a trial that was for good reason, and we'll be able to really ascertain some productive data that will give us a path forward on this particular item.
I'll just add, in addition to what has already been said, I think over the last 14, 15 months, we have listened to our colleagues, to our students, to our faculty in ways that we probably have not listened in a while, which has allowed us to be more graceful, be more compassionate. I think that there is going to be an expectation from students and faculty that we do that moving forward. And so, you know, regardless of what happens with COVID, we're going to be expected to, you know, meet students where they are when it comes to the delivery of courses, be expected to meet faculty where they are as it comes to their preparedness to teach in any modality. So this idea of continued and strengthened focus on faculty professional development is going to be important moving forward. And then definitely training our faculty and our students on how to communicate with each other. I think many of us found ourselves over the last year or so serving as a referee in a number of venues, but definitely helping our students and our faculty continue to strengthen their communication with each other.
Very good points.
As a number of individuals have said, the pandemic was really an accelerant. I have to admit, this is my favorite question, because I think it forced us into some spaces that we needed to be in. And although we didn't anticipate getting there that quickly, what we've learned now we can leverage as we move forward. So I think about self-service. So we implemented a financial aid chat bot. We rolled out a Navigate mobile student app to streamline resources and be able to pulse poll our students and reach out and determine their needs. We did a lot more with online videos and distributing through social media how-tos on various things, whether it was risk mitigation, whether it was just opportunities available to them. And those things I anticipate will continue. We also had the hybrid shift, and the hybrid is really the best of both worlds for our students. So when they need to be able to connect to their academic advisor or a career coach in the evening because we've extended our hours, they're able to do that. Maybe they don't want to drive back to campus and they want to connect with their disability services counselor from their apartment. They can do that as well. So I think that we've set an expectation in terms of service delivery that we'll need to continue. The other thing that I think we learned is we can't take our continuing students for granted. So even if they're registered for the upcoming term, we can't make assumptions. And so where we called all of our continuing undergraduates last summer with our Student Success Center leading a group with FAQs and 200 volunteers, we can't duplicate that every year. That's not realistic. But what we can do is contact our rising sophomores, because that's the group that now have had the most unusual first year experience, are probably less connected than they were in previous years, and may need a little extra assistance as they assimilate into what is their second year, but in many cases may feel like their first year.
Thank you for that, Stacey. That leads into the next question. How will you continue to engage continuing students and their families in the pursuit and completion of post-secondary education? There's some trend data that kind of highlights that, trend data out there that's available that highlights that there's a lack of interest in pursuing post-secondary ed because of the pandemic, and students aren't necessarily seeing a value in pursuing a credential of post-secondary status. So how will you continue to engage students in the enrollment process and the recruitment process and completing what they started?
Well, I'll take a first crack at this, coming at it from a system level, is that we partner with a number of different agencies and third-party organizations to really help expand the message on the value, value proposition for post-secondary education, whether it's working with the Department of Children and Family Services, whether it's working with our Workforce Commission, whether it's working with our Economic Development Office, whether it's working with United Way, whether it's, you name it. We're in regions across the state that we partner with, that we provide them with tools, with different sorts of data tools and student service tools from the Board of Regents to help inform those conversations with students. And some of those aspects, we're piloting that, some of the approach that we're taking with messaging and collaboration, but the vision is to scale that across our state. So with that said, it's not just with K-12 students, it's also with those adult learners, and it's everyone in between, those who are looking to go back to complete what they started or to learn a whole new skill and vocation altogether. So for us, it's really being able to make very clear and transparent with our partners across the state, the opportunities that are available to them. Now, I'll also say that it also helps to have a legislature approved funding for adult learners across the state, which they did this past week as our legislature drew to our legislative session drew to a close yesterday. But there was recognition from across different stakeholders and parties involved with public financing and with post-secondary and K-12 education that there is something to be said about ensuring that folks have an opportunity to pursue what they want as a career aspiration or just to get back up on their feet. And the best way to get there is through possibilities with post-secondary education. So that's kind of my long and short of it, but that's what I would offer from a system or board level perspective.
Absolutely. I agree. One, as institutions, we all have to continue to tell our stories. So pushing those stories out, our student stories, pushing those student success stories out there. There is no question that earning a credential increases your quality of life, increases your lifetime earnings. In the state of Mississippi, we have our Complete to Compete initiative, which is going after those folks who started college and didn't finish, and institutions are reaching out to get them to continue. I think, as has been mentioned, we must continue to reach out to our continuing students, to reach out to our new students, and continue to strengthen our pipeline in our middle and in our high schools. It's going to be incumbent upon us to educate them about the values of a college education, continue to work with policymakers and lawmakers in our states in order that we can continue to get the investments that we need in order to be successful as campuses. And I have to say, as a higher education professional, when I read the stories with folks questioning the value of a college education and talking about college not being worth it, as a first generation college student myself, and thinking about my trajectory, I shudder to think what my life would be had I not earned my college degrees. And so I think we have to continue, again, to educate folks about the value of attending college.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think one of the things that is actually valuable to us is that nationally, the conversation has shifted from inputs to outcomes in terms of higher education. And so being responsive to that means that we're leveraging that career services ecosystem. We're utilizing employers and alumni and faculty and student services staff and parents to really connect all of those pieces and all of those opportunities for students. Another shift that is, I think, really valuable is going from that first destination survey where we're looking at, what is a student earning when they first get out of school, to looking at 5 and 10 years out and those longer term benefits, and really assessing what makes a difference. I mean, we know things like internships, on our campus, it's about a $9,000 differential, $9,000 differential in starting salaries if a student has an internship, paid or unpaid. But getting the word out to students and families about the things that matter, and then make sure we're facilitating those. So early experience, internships, early engagement with the job search process, all of those things have value. Networking with employers. How are we facilitating that so that we can then communicate the value? Because I think if we deliver on the promise we make to our students, that fuels itself. So it's not that we say it, it's that we do it.
And I'll just chime in. I think it's really important that we connect the outcomes. I have 2 grown children who are both working and off my payroll, and that was my goal with their education. I want them to have a quality of life. I want them to be able to enjoy the work that they do. And so I think staying focused on what education can deliver and making sure that we're connecting those outcomes is really important. In North Carolina, we created a nonprofit committee called My Future NC with our attainment goal and credential goal. But one of the things that we know is if you don't have an income to pay your rent, if you can't afford food, you need to get into the job market quickly. You need to start earning an income so that you can support your family. And sometimes a short-term workforce credential can get you back in the workforce, particularly when the economy is shifting and changing. It can add to skills that you already have. It can help you upskill and get or change career paths. So we're really focusing on thinking about those short-term credentials, but not thinking about them in a vacuum. Because as those individuals continue to grow in their career, they need to be able to continue that education. So rather than serving a student one time, we want to serve a student over their lifetime. So as they move up in that career, how can we then transition them into associate degree or diploma or certificate that then can articulate into a 4-year degree and master's degree and doctorate and wherever our students want to go. But sometimes we have to help them take that first step because you have to be able to support your family first. So I think those short-term credentials are really important. Credit for prior learning is very important, that we make sure that students get all the credit that they're due so that they continue toward that credential and that credential attainment. And then I think several people have mentioned, so I won't belabor the point too much, But if you can't afford your rent and if you can't afford food and you need that credential to get back in the workforce, you also have financial barriers that we have to support students. And oftentimes that's more than just tuition and fees. So how do we help students with transportation, living expenses, childcare, all of those other things that play into or put barriers in front of our students of being able to get that credential and to attain that credential. One of the things that we did this year for one of the first time in my academic history is we provided scholarships, significant scholarships for our short-term workforce students. And so that really helped get students into those jobs. And, you know, there's a lot of occupations in North Carolina that we're struggling to fill. You know, just the supply chain, getting people into the workplace. Our employers need employees. So not only do these students need jobs, our employers need those employees. So reducing those financial barriers. We've also just announced a scholarship for the 2021 graduates of high school, knowing that they've been particularly impacted. So reducing that financial barrier for them, as well as our returning students. So those students who may be stopped out, how can we entice them to come back by saying, if you're 50% complete toward an associate degree or a credential, we have some financial incentives or financial support to help you come back and finish that credential. So I think the reducing those financial barriers, but also not just focusing on four-year residential college as a path to employment, but providing those flexible pathways to meet students where they are and in the communities where they currently live.
Absolutely. Those are all great points. So to close out our conversation and then give way to a couple of questions from those who may be joining us virtually, what has been your largest takeaway or lesson learned in your leadership roles in higher education about how to support students moving forward?
Well, my biggest takeaway from, granted, we don't have the opportunity to work at a student level to the extent that my institution colleagues do at their campuses. But one thing I can assure you is that within our neck of the woods, we've learned quite a bit about the different work that can be accomplished within all of our teams across our office, as I sort of described earlier, as to how we can provide service to our systems and to our institutions to really, remind us that in order to to really serve our students well across the state, we need to understand what it is they need. So we really work closely with our system and our institution leadership, and I think that we've found immense value in we have to reach out to our students and we have to do those surveys, and those are the type of things, even though it's not us administering them but working through the institutions, we need the feedback to really understand how how a board and a system can best serve students. So for us, I think our big takeaway is that we have to be engaged with our students in order to serve them effectively. I know it's not it's not an epiphany of any sorts. It's just that that's the reality of it, and it's been highlighted over the course of the past year.
I agree. I think there have been a number of epiphanies over the course of the last year, but I go back to my earlier point about listening. I think the more and more stories that we heard and that we listened to over the last year, it made us want to work harder. It made us want to be more innovative. It made us want to partner more, both on campus and throughout the Mississippi IHL system. And even with colleagues across state lines as well. So I partnered with my old colleagues in North Carolina on working through some things as well. But I think ultimately is this continued understanding and respect for individual differences, a number of individual differences, and using our partners, using our communities and colleagues to continue to help our students to be successful.
Thank you.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think that listening really is a key. The other thing, and I mentioned this before, was really thinking about how we deliver services to our students. So whether that's self-service, what can they do on their own? Whether it's hybrid, so we can have those sort of the best of both worlds benefits and they have flexibility. The other thing that I didn't mention that I think is important is that leads to efficiency. And then we can focus our efforts and our time and those in-person engagements with those who need it the most. And the reality is higher ed isn't funded in a way that we can do that across the board. We have to be targeted and we have to be intentional. And technology and self-service and hybrid service delivery enable us to do that in a way that is really valuable. And so I think throwing us into that immediately really forced us to shift in a nimble way. And I think that nimbleness is something that we need to maintain.
I'll just echo, I really like the point Dr. Wooden made about listening, and I think that's so important, but I also think I would just add one word to that is proactive and strategic actually that's 2 words, proactive and strategic listening, because when you were telling the story about how you contacted students, you asked the question and then you listened. And I think we do have to be proactive and reaching out and making sure that we're getting that feedback. And then the other thing I think that we've all learned is being flexible. At the system level, there's this continual balance that we're trying to achieve between harnessing the power of our system, but also recognizing that our individual institutions are in communities that have unique needs and our students have unique needs. So how do we balance that flexibility to serve a local community in a way that meets the needs of that community while maintaining a system response to education and harnessing the power of being a system? And I think that flexibility is something that we're going to continue to learn about and continue to learn how to do well and how to adapt to those communities, because flexibility, we've all had to be flexible, and I think we'll continue to be flexible.
Thank you. That concludes our question from myself and the SREB perspective. Jasmine, do we have any questions in the chat box at all?
I don't have any questions that came in, but a lot of really good feedback on adding what you guys had already shared. Someone had mentioned the necessity of touching on financial aid or finances for a lot of our students, as many of them will be impacted as they enter into the real world or their career fields. Another point was, the comment that talked about the full virtual environment that students are dealing with right now and their progression as they learn how to adapt. And I think you all talked about that on the various platforms and really just finding their way through that and how that affects their communication. One other one here talks about how students aren't able to find their niche because there is the lack of human interaction, and it's the responsibility of the university to really help foster that and help bridge those gaps.
Thank you all for those who provided your comments, excuse me, in the chat box. This concludes our first webinar in this series, and we certainly thank our panelists for being able to be a part of this presentation and discussion this morning. And we also thank our attendees who were able to join us virtually. Please look out for additional webinars that will be a part of this series later this summer. We also have another one scheduled this afternoon as well, focusing on teacher shortages throughout the South, which will be led by Megan Boren, who leads our effort relative to preparing a more diversified and qualified workforce, teacher workforce throughout our region. So again, thank you so much, and we appreciate your engagement with SREB. Good afternoon.